grateful and pleased to have the following panelists discuss the Christian tradition and respond to the paper by Oliver O'Donovan, Eric Gregory, who's Assistant Professor in the Department of Religion at Princeton University, Serene Jones, the Titus Street Professor of Theology at Yale Divinity School, Ronald Rittgers, the Associate Professor of History of Christianity at the Yale Divinity School, and Miroslav Volf, the Henry B. Wright Professor of Theology at Yale Divinity School. Each of the panelists will take up to 15 minutes for some remarks. I won't again break in. We'll simply take them in the following order: Ronald Rittgers, then Serene Jones, then Eric Gregory, then Miroslav Volf. And at 9 o'clock there will be a question and answer period that will last for 45 minutes, and I should say that at that time we will encourage you to direct questions either to the lecturer or to the panelists. So it will be open season at that juncture. And as I say, there's no reason for me to play any further role, so I will introduce our panelists with thanks.
I'm Ron Rittgers, teach church history here at Yale Divinity School, and I wish to thank Joseph Cumming and Jean Outka for inviting me to participate in this very important conference. It's certainly a great honor. Unlike my esteemed colleagues, Professors Volf, Jones, Gregory, and especially Professor O'Donovan, I am neither a theologian nor an ethicist, but as Professor Outka has just mentioned, a mild-mannered historian. I have been asked to participate, I think, in order to provide some historical or descriptive context for the normative questions that frame this conference. In his talk, Professor O'Donovan focused on the first of those questions that were put to us, they're on the website now, which asks if Christians and Muslims may participate in good faith in civil societies in North America and Europe without violating non-negotiable convictions internal to their respective religious traditions. I would like to direct my brief comments to our third question, which asked us to consider how congenial a doctrine of two governments is to Christians and Muslims respectively. My task is not to evaluate such a doctrine for its theological or ethical adequacy, but to explain why it emerged and what it meant. After providing this description, I will seek very briefly to relate my analysis to Professor O'Donovan's concluding remarks about, the secularity of late modern political thought. In the Christian tradition, it's fair to say that the doctrine of the two kingdoms, this idea, is associated most especially with the 16th century German reformer Martin Luther. Before I discuss Luther, I would first like to say a word about the sort of historical lead-up to him, beginning with the early church. An essential and defining feature of early Christianity was its status as a religious minority in the Roman Empire that suffered occasional, if sometimes brutal, persecution. Even after the so-called Constantinian Revolution of the 4th century, in which the Roman emperor granted Christianity most favored cult status, the church never fully forgot its original independence. And while temporal rulers would go on to exercise considerable authority over the church, especially after the fall of Rome and the church's turn northward for new alliances and new converts, most of these rulers recognized a separate sphere that belonged to the church, the governance of souls, administration of the sacraments, though admittedly this sphere could be construed extremely narrowly, especially in the reign of, for example, somebody like Charlemagne, who once told the Pope that his sole job was to administer sacraments and to raise his hands in prayers like Moses to pray for Charlemagne's military victories. Similarly, even in the Gregorian reform movement of the 11th and 12th centuries, when popes sought to free the church from lay domination and to exert considerable sway over the temporal sphere, Gregory VII himself once sought to excommunicate and depose the Roman Emperor, or the Holy Roman Emperor, the bishops of Rome, perhaps Gregory VII is an exception here, still recognized the divinely ordained prerogatives of kings and princes to govern the mundane sphere, although they believed that the power of the keys, that is, the authority to bind and loose sins, provided them with a kind of important trump card when temporal rulers acted against their wishes. The goal I'm trying to drive at here was never to create a theocracy in this sense, in which a restricted class of specially gifted human beings functioned as God's mouthpiece, and thus exercised full and unquestioned authority over all spiritual and temporal affairs. Western Christianity, it seems to me, is marked by an ongoing tension between clerical leaders and temporal rulers to realize what each took to be God's intended order for governing and redeeming God's world. As both sides jockeyed for position in this relationship, neither, or very few, sought to dissolve it entirely. For both sides, it seems to me, realized that there was something necessary about this tension. Luther certainly did not seek to resolve this tension. Rather, he sought to protect it. We see this clearly in his doctrine of the two kingdoms, or his Zwei-Reiche-Lehre. According to this doctrine, there are two distinct spheres of human existence, the temporal and the spiritual, and God has ordained a distinct system of authority for each one. God rules the temporal kingdom through God's left hand, Luther would say, and God superintends the spiritual kingdom through God's right hand. The temporal kingdom pertains to the life of the body, that is, to having that which has to do with the outer person, while the spiritual kingdom pertains to the life of the soul, the inner person. Both kingdoms must respect each other's jurisdiction, but both also need each other to carry out their respective duties. Christ rules the spiritual kingdom by his word, the sword of the Spirit. His is an invisible kingdom that reigns in the hearts of believers. It is not identical with the church as a visible institution. Christ's goal in his kingdom was to promote inward righteousness through the preaching of the law, that is, the Ten Commandments, and the gospel. And it is the clergy who are determined the content of the preaching, not the temporal ruler. The Sermon on the Mount is to serve as the code of ethics for the spiritual kingdom, and there could be no coercion in the spiritual kingdom because true saving faith could never be forced, could never be coerced. According to Luther, there was also absolute equality among members of the spiritual kingdom. All were priests and kings. Finally, there was a right of nonviolent resistance in the spiritual kingdom, as the Christian was not to submit to false teaching and false piety, at least not inwardly. The temporal kingdom then, according to Luther, was ruled by God the Father and included all human beings, not just Christians. Luther believed that God had entrusted his authority to govern the temporal realm to a number of what one might call surrogate fathers: emperors, princes, lords, city magistrates, teachers, fathers. Each of these patriarchs was to govern those entrusted to his care as a strict but caring father. The task of each ruler was to promote external righteousness, or observance of the natural law, all in an effort to uphold peace and order so that the outer person could prosper and the gospel be effectually preached. To assist temporal rulers in this endeavor, God had entrusted them with the temporal sword, which gave them authority over the life and property of their subjects. As might be expected, there was no equality in the temporal kingdom, nor was there a right of resistance, at least initially in Luther. One simply had to endure the external oppression of a tyrant. Luther developed this doctrine of the two kingdoms for at least two reasons. To protect the church, and here he meant his fledgling reform movement in Germany, from suppression by unsympathetic temporal rulers. Initially, Luther calls upon princes in Germany to take up the role of emergency bishops to promote the kind of reform that he wishes. And then when some of these emergency bishops start commanding the burning of his books, he develops the doctrine of the two kingdoms. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it, which became especially important as the Reformation proceeded, was to protect temporal rulers, and more particularly the temporal sphere in general, from religious, whom Luther would call religious radicals, who wished to set up the kingdom of God on earth. That is, the doctrine of the two kingdoms was also designed to protect against the possibility of theocracy. I admit that no one in this conference will likely propose a direct transference of Luther's 16th century political philosophy to the present day, although I know people who would like to. The cultural limitations of the Reformers' doctrine, I think, are probably self-evident. But examining the doctrine as it was originally propounded has at least one important advantage for our purposes today. It seems to me that it demonstrates how Luther shared the same, what Professor Donovan called moral faith, that he noted in Richard Hooker and other early modern thinkers. As we have seen, Luther invokes both natural law and the divine origins of temporal government in his explication of the temporal kingdom. This is God's left hand. I would imagine that any attempt to revise and retrieve Luther's doctrine for modern usage would be greatly hindered by the late modern attempt to ground governance of the temporal sphere on self-sufficient public rules. The secularity that Professor O'Donovan sees in late medieval political thought makes retrieval of any early modern political doctrine extremely difficult. I look forward to hearing from the theologians and ethicists how such a retrieval is possible without, in effect, cutting off God's left hand. Thank you.
I'm Serene Jones, and I want to begin by thanking Professor O'Donovan for his, and it's always the case, very thought-provoking. And this afternoon I was struck also by even the poetic quality of your work and your paper presented here. Also, Ron, thank you. You're hardly a mild-mannered historian. And going after you, I should announce myself by saying, and now for a word from the Calvinist, who has no qualms about saying that we should, in fact, translate Calvin directly into the present context and to build that political order. Let me first begin by saying I'm not a political theorist, but I read political theory avidly. I'm a systematic theologian, and I firmly believe that our high-minded doctrines, as well as our more lowbrow, commonplace beliefs, profoundly shape our social actions in the terms of our political engagement, and that those political engagements need to be theoretically interrogated as rigorously as our faith claims. And I should say as well is that I've taught Desire of the Nations for years now. In fact, it was the main text in my first theology seminar ever at this school. And I have profound respect for the way in which you engage these two conversation partners in a dialogue that is as rigorous as it is creative. My comments are divided into three parts. First, I want to respond directly to your argument. Secondly, I want to raise a query about the social aim of this kind of analysis. And third, I want to offer a few reflections on how I, as a liberal Reformed theologian, might theologically argue more strongly for a liberal political theory. First, response to your central argument. At the risk of being way too general, I take it to be this. In answer to the question, can Christians and Muslims participate in civil society in North America and Europe without violating their convictions? Your answer is yes, but not without substantially rethinking the liberal political framework that undergirds it, one which places both procedural and substantive constraints on belief. Your critique, I take it, is in large part, although not exhaustively, an imminent one. Out of fear that religious conflicts will heighten, not lessen, political disagreement, liberal theory divides normative claims into second and first order types. You question the division at several levels. Conceptually, it doesn't hold. First order claims ground second order, and second order claims cannot live without them. Secondly, experientially, the vision of the good life can't be siphoned off from the language of rights and obligation, having given birth to the two of them. And thirdly, historically, you argue that constitutional democracy was originally constructed to allow the public expression of belief, not to silence it. And to all of this, I want to say amen. it seems entirely right-headed to me. I've reached similar conclusions, albeit with the help of critical theory, the work of feminist political theory, engaging figures like Pateman, Young, Bin Habib, and Roger Smith. It does strike me, however, that there are two places where liberal convictions may perhaps haunt not necessarily the normative claims, but the project as a whole. And I want to just flag these for further conversation. First of all, when we talk about restraint on religious beliefs, your argument at times suggests that structurally all beliefs share some feature qua belief. It makes the conversation possible. But I want to suggest that perhaps this is not so, that just like the category of religion in its problematic character, so too belief raises similar challenges. And related to this, an understanding of belief's relation to moral action. Perhaps there is no universal taxonomy here as well. And it's important to note this, I think, not just with respect to how Christians might differently conceive of the relationship between belief to practices from Muslims, but internal to Christianity itself, this relationship has historically been configured in diverse ways. All right, secondly, a comment about the social aim of the discussion. At times, it can appear that in critiques of liberal democracy, that the undergirding suggestion is that on the ground in North America and Europe, people's actual religious convictions are being actively excluded from public political discourse. That liberal theory somehow, at a pragmatic level, actually reigns. Now, perhaps this is somewhat true in Europe, but it doesn't fit my experience in the United States. Everyone makes political religious claims on the street, but also in Supreme Court hearings, on the Senate floor, in presidential debates. Moreover, I heard in a talk just this afternoon, if one were to empirically investigate the status of persons in the United States' relation to religious discourse, the majority of them would say outright that yes, absolutely, religious beliefs should have a role in public debate, should be expressed, and that it is necessary for the functioning of the democracy. Now, on the one hand, liberal political theory in its secular mode is blind if it doesn't see this. And the interesting empirical information, John Evans, I don't know if he's here yet, spoke to this afternoon, suggests that this concern that religious beliefs be spoken in the public sphere is just as strongly held by secular people as it is by religious persons. So, liberal political theory in its secular mode is blind if it doesn't see this, but could it also be the case that critiques of liberal political theory from a theological perspective are problematic if it assumes an alive and powerful bad guy called liberal secularism, which oppressively rules the roost and needs to be deposed? It doesn't exist, at least as a significant political force or a cultural attitude. And in this regard, I just want to flag the fact that when we talk about Europe and the United States, we may be talking about two profoundly different political and social environments with respect to the status of religious claims. I also want to add to this the observation sociologically that it has long been the case in the United States that the construction of, and this was addressed this afternoon in a lecture on the empirical character of religious claims in the United States, what people actually hold. It has long been the case that in the construction of evangelical Christianity, the positing of a secular bad guy has been part of the boundary-making discourse constitutive to an internal logic of that tradition. And we need to question whether or not the simple positing of a bad guy actually constitutes its real existence. I want to add to this second contextualizing question another topic that I think bears pertinently on this, and it has to do with the difference between the United States and Europe. I was struck again and again in the public conversations over the cartoon that caused such controversy in Europe by the fact that it's difficult to imagine a similar scene unfolding in this context. And why is that? What are the habits of democratic thought embedded in our bodily practices as well as social practices that make it more difficult to imagine it unfolding in this context? All right, thirdly, and very quickly, an alternative account of liberal civil society. At the end of your lecture, you provocatively raised this challenge. I want to suggest that as a Reformed theologian, when I look at the political sphere and reflect on the nature of human persons, I have a trifocal rather than bifocal view. When it comes to what we can expect from humanity, particularly with respect to the possibilities of social life, I see three possibilities. First of all, and here I put on my hat as a systematic theologian, when we locate our reflections on humanity in the political order in the doctrine of creation, which I take it to be primarily in this paper the site in which your own theological reflections find their most welcome home, we get a picture that looks something like this. Persons are fundamentally good, called to flourish in relation to God, given the law to follow in the process of that flourishing, and in responding to that law, actually understood as capable of social agreement. The law and procedural practices embedded in a doctrine of creation leave us with an optimistic, if not somewhat timid, based on an understanding of finitude, understanding of the social order. But right next to that, we have the doctrine of sin. In this configuration, persons are conceived as deeply, profoundly, irrevocably flawed. They have turned away from God, and in doing so turned against neighbor. And the feature of this turning that is most troubling is that as humanity participates in it, it deceives itself with respect to that turning. It is epistemically unavailable to humanity to see, apart from grace, the depths of its sin. And I would add to this the Bardian critique that the worst form this sin takes can be the form of religion. Religious beliefs at their strongest can be religious beliefs at their worst. This leads to, with respect to the political order, a profound skepticism, an expectation of political conflict, and an appreciation for the aggression of interest. And in this context, democracy can be conceived as a way of constraining sin by pluralizing power. So we have on the first hand doctrine of creation and understanding of law and constitution, doctrine of sin, democracy and pluralization, and finally the doctrine of grace. Thirdly, when it comes to grace, human beings are ultimately defined by divine mercy, that they own nothing apart from what is given to them in grace. Apart from merit, they are extrinsically defined. With respect to law and political formation, we are called to give it our best, knowing that we are earning nothing divine in the process. An attitude that both relaxes and makes more open the sphere of the political. Law is what it is, a guide to discipleship, not in any way a highway to heaven or a guarantee of flourishing. So three attitudes towards political authority: the doctrine of creation, confidence, optimism about what faith can accomplish; sin, humility, profound skepticism and critique, and a worry about religion in its strongest articulations; and grace, a lightness of touch and an attitude of generosity. Can you order these three? First, second, perhaps third order? No. Perhaps they are, at one level, incoherent if coherence involves being able to put them in a nice calculated order in relation to one another. I would suggest instead that they are trifocal or perhaps holographic, laid upon one another in an ever-shifting frame of emphasis.
It's an honor and a privilege to be back at Yale. It's reminding me now, Yale is a place where mild-mannered historians do serious theology and systematic theologians do serious political theory. We didn't plan this, but I think I'm going to form the third part of a trifocal critical response to Professor O'Donovan. Since I learned my Augustinian dispositions, in part from Professor O'Donovan and Professor Outka, I thought I would begin with a brief confession and then highlight one basic agreement that I share with his talk and close with two critical responses. Like Professor O'Donovan, I am a Christian. Unlike Professor O'Donovan, I am an American. Most of the time, and here is the real confession, I don't feel a deep conflict between my civic identity and my prior religious identity. Ambivalence is easy, but full-blown suspicion doesn't come naturally to me. I can fake it, adopting a prophetic stance with the best of them. My Christian students like my Hauerwas lectures, at least until we get to all that pacifism stuff. They also like my Milbank lectures, at least until we get to that socialism stuff and his European tropes that rootless America is not really a society at all. They even like my O'Donovan lectures. I need to have a glass of water before I say this.
Stronger.
Yeah, something stronger. At least until we get to what he has to say about the First Amendment as an unwitting deist and evangelical collusion that undermines Trinitarian orthodoxy and excludes government from possible evangelical obedience. Much to my students' confusion, I try my best to charitably inhabit these theological worlds. My own distaste for civil religion is genuine. But for good or for ill, I participate in good faith in the mixed bag of virtues and vices that characterize American civil society. I don't rule out of court the possibility of a fundamental conflict, but political theology should do more than just unmask. My faith demands that I do not feel completely at home in America. To say that I do not have a profound existential struggle with my American identity does not mean that I'm not critical of my government's policies. Today, I fear the emerging oligarchy of charismatic hucksters, corporate elites, technocratic policy wonks, and my fellow Christians who support them. Liberal democracy can make excessive religious demands if you let it. Mass democracy presents its own challenges. But I think, on the whole, the tradition of democratic republicanism, given the history of my society, is the least bad way of both theorizing and governing public life. As Augustine said of Rome, it is not yet holy, but it is still less vile. Democracy is deficient, but it is not heresy all the way down. So I have a concessive and provisional gratitude for the gift of democracy. My normative approval is more than just a modus vivendi. And one of the topics I hope we'll begin talking about tomorrow is this question in relation to the Islamic tradition as to whether contemporary democratic defenders of Islamic law as the antidote to post-colonial corrupt governments are merely pragmatic defenders of democracy, at least until they win, or something else that can find a normative way of approving democratic practices in Islamic societies compatible with Islamic faith. But like Professor O'Donovan, I hope to listen a lot tomorrow. I still remember my low church, high Christology Baptist Sunday school classes on the separation of church and state. With a heavy dose of Calvin and Roger Williams, Mrs. Grolig emphasized religious liberty, principled pluralism, and the confession that the state is under the lordship of Christ. They taught democratic culture is the wayward child of Christianity, rooted in the liberty and equality announced in the gospel, embodied in the legacy of Christendom, the responsible rule of law for citizens, not the domination of subjects by arbitrary emperors and British kings. Christians are to defer to no one but God. The natural freedom of the individual is as deep as the freedom of God. They taught me citizenship was part and parcel of the obligation to love the neighbor and to pursue liberty and justice with humility. So too did Professor O'Donovan. But my Sunday school teachers also conveyed the notion that the best way to harm religious faith is to establish it. Christians are supposed to worry about the temptations of theocracy and self-deceptive claims to a politically established universal vision. Distribution of power is not a sign of moral confusion, but a way, as Professor Jones said, of constraining sin by pluralizing power. Democracy means the humble state makes no pretentious metaphysical claims. Political life, always coercive, is not the realm of our deepest commitments. Rights are not entitlements conferred by the state, but we can have democratic community without agreeing on everything. I can give this Sunday school version a more sophisticated slant now. With O'Donovan, it relies on the doctrine of the two that affirms secularity without bowing down to secularism, secularity as the time between the times. It is realist without thinking sin and eschatology are the only Christian words for politics. It recognizes finitude and resists perfectionism, but it aims from politics more than just not killing each other and managing the conditions of economic exchange. Political community, at its best, secures penultimate historical, moral identities that are responsive to the goods that the state can secure. So democracy is not morally bankrupt, but it is not the only game in town. I don't think there is an ideal normative political arrangement, short of the heavenly city. Here, there is no unity to ethics and politics. Some arrangements and the loves they embody and express are morally better than others. Some encourage what is noble, others what is base. Political culture and its institutions shape and create virtues. Democratic justice, equality, and solidarity are virtues, albeit imperfect political virtues awaiting their transformation. Their practice should be celebrated and encouraged, not condemned by Christians worried about theoretical purity. I fundamentally agree with Professor O'Donovan that a constitutional state should not demand restraint on the expression of belief. Democratic speech should abide moral restraints of practical reason, but accounts of civil society that are structured to police belief are bad accounts, especially when they single out religious belief as subject to domestication. They are unjust, anti-democratic, philosophically wrong-headed, and politically self-defeating. We should let 1,000 flowers bloom in the garden of political discourse. I may be filled with youthful enthusiasm, but I actually think this is the direction of most democratic theory today. The idea of public reason is falling on hard times, though it will take a while for this view to crumble under its own weight. Radical Democrats, civic Republicans, pragmatists, associative and deliberative Democrats, agonistic feminists, postmodern secularists, all today join with Christian critics of this mode of theorizing constitutional democracy. Attacks on the foundational status of procedural rules serve different purposes, some of which O'Donovan would rightly reject, some he might accept. As an aside, I should mention I'm less sure than O'Donovan that Rawls's original position demands a strong contrast between a self-regarding logic, liable to skepticism, and Spamann's logic of mutual respect, funded by substantive morality. Rawls himself denied such interpretations and saw his enemy as utilitarianism, more so, I think, than religion, but I leave Rawls for another day and grant the difference between Christian personalism and post-Christian pluralism. Let me end with two critical responses, having given a confession and a basic agreement. I'm going to state them with the most polemic I can muster. Both are of American vintage. First, I wonder if Professor O'Donovan is too much of an Enlightenment liberal, something I doubt he's ever been accused of being. He criticizes the way in which Spamann and Rawls make use of the distinction between two orders of belief, especially the search for more basic agreement by recourse to norm-regulating norms that ensure the priority of agreement over disagreement. But he seems too readily accepting of the possibility of distinguishing first and second-order beliefs, compartmentalizing them, and subjecting one to the other. He argues against the proposal that second-order beliefs trump first-order beliefs. But why doesn't he challenge the very distinction, alongside the neo-Kantian attempt to compartmentalize orders of belief in the first place? He hints at this possibility in the claim that modern political theory requires second-order beliefs that regulate first-order beliefs. He criticizes Spamann's distinction as jarring painfully with Christian philosophy. But why not abandon the concept of orders of belief altogether? Doesn't that language allow one to pretend that one is not engaging the content of belief in the very effort to regulate it? I suspect it might be because of his account of Hooker's natural law. But a political theory that doesn't appeal to natural law in this way would not have to endorse the distinction between orders of belief or the submission of one vague set of belief to another. Rather, it would endorse a commitment among citizens to engage in dialogical reason about political problems with all of their beliefs in tow. To commit to this dialogue need not mean Christians abandon their beliefs. We exchange reasons in public deliberation. We respect legal precedent and political authority. We vote. We elect representatives. We're not surprised by moral agreement, as if it was an accidental coincidence of overlapping consensus. We may hope everyone believed and practiced the same thing, if that belief and practice is true and good, and not simply my or the church's conception of the common good. We're not filled with pathos and despair when there is disagreement. Why do we need this distinction? Or is he willing to abandon it as a dream proposal? My second response, in closing, gets closer to the core argument, I think, about the thing itself. O'Donovan doesn't like late modern theories of democracy, especially those that hubristically locate ultimate authority in the people and think that norms arise only as generated by social agreement among human beings. Indeed, I'm not sure he has a normative commitment to democracy as a system of governance. So he stands with some Muslim thinkers who, with constitutional safeguards, take God to be the legitimate source of law and seek to discern legal intent through examination of privileged scriptural sources. His problem is with secularist concepts of constitutionalism and secularist concepts of democracy. Now, today he said political society is not an idea, but an organism. He also knows ideas have consequences and concepts matter. They mediate experience. They create living options for practice. But I want to hear more about what satisfies the philosophical Christian and what is necessary for the actual practice of conflict-ridden politics. I'm not sure what work his internally integrated universal vision is meant to do. What does he mean by its prosecution? I share his vision if we want to talk about it that way, but I don't think I share his account of authority. Perhaps I am internally disintegrated or too complacent in my willingness to live in the unfreedom of dissonance of belief and practice. But what good does it do to make politics more comprehensible in O'Donovan's sense? I suspect his account of compromise would be a point of contact. But does he aspire to provide a theory of Christian constitutionalism that would ambitiously claim to legislate the terms of social cooperation? What about rival claims to revelation? He doesn't want to second-guess other traditions of belief. But could he imagine learning something new about God from Muslim theology that would have a political consequence? Is he open to the fraternal correction of Muslim theologians? Can the state presuppose a controversial vision that some citizens, religious or secular, reasonably reject? He seems very confident that competitive discourse might yield political arrangements that reflect determinate theological beliefs. What would Europe look like today if political culture listened to O'Donovan? His theological concept of authority is part of his praiseworthy effort to construct a better kind of liberalism that does not reduce theology to an ethics of interior motivation. I share in this effort, and I was struck by his analogy between the 21st century and the 16th century. Though I suspect Grotius, for me, is closer to Spinoza and Kant than to Hooker. He tried to make religion into a liberal morality that would be conducive for pluralism. With O'Donovan, I can imagine a different Christian political society as what might be or might have been if we got our theology better. But I guess of all the challenges facing Christians and Democrats, I don't rank bad concepts of authority as high on my list as he does. That may be just a strategic difference. It's an empirical question whether a democratic society can sustain itself, let alone flourish, without theoretical consensus. I hope it doesn't require that. Part of being American is my immersion in the down-home wisdom of Chicago, Baltimore, Boston, Princeton, and New Haven. Augustine worried quite a bit about his students, lest they fall under the influence of false teachers, just as he did. I hope these remarks do not make Professor O'Donovan too worried about me. He may fear I've been sniffing the pragmatist aroma of America for too long, but I stand ready for correction and clarification. Like democracies and the Christian church, I'm still on the way.
My name is Miroslav Volf, and speaking last has a distinct advantage. You want to respond to the responders, cheer on, disagree, qualify, whatever it is. Conversation is expanding, and I have to participate only in one segment of it. But so things are. We will discuss after my presentation, and I hope all of you will join us. But first, as a director of Yale Center for Faith and Culture, let me use this opportunity first to welcome you all to this conference, which the center is co-sponsoring. More precisely, the center's new reconciliation program, directed by Joseph Cumming. It's this program that is co-sponsoring the conference together with Yale Divinity School's outside lectureship committee. Now, let me say a few words about the reconciliation program. It was founded to address some of the great issues, religious, political, economic, emerging as the two largest religions in the world today interface, Islam and Christianity. And since neither Islam nor Christianity can be properly understood in their origins and in their contemporary form without reference to Judaism, the reconciliation program seeks to attend to these great issues in Christian-Muslim relations in conversation with Judaism. One of the central problems facing our faiths is their relation to the democratic traditions of the democratic tradition of the West, a tradition which is shaping civic life in an increasing number of nations around the globe. This conference is the first public event of the reconciliation program. So welcome to this conference, and welcome to the reconciliation program stepping into or onto the public stage. I'm delighted that Professor Oliver O'Donovan has agreed to join us and give one of two major papers. In my estimation, he belongs among the very few of the most erudite and seminal Christian moral theologians today. For some years now, he has been offering incisive criticism of late modern political theories and practices, as well as suggesting contours of a compelling alternative. For both of these endeavors, he is drawing creatively on the resources of Christian theology. He is a political theologian in the best sense of that term. His rich presentation today shows him to be such. In this presentation, Oliver is pressing an issue central to the functioning of liberal democracies. It is the character of the relationship between what he calls the terms of civic association, regulative principles, which he describes as second-order claims, so between these terms of civic association and universal visions of the members of these associations, comprehensive theoretical doctrines, which he describes as first-order claims. Since in liberal democracies, the second-order rules regulate public expression of the first-order universal visions, they are inhospitable to believers of any sort, he argues. That which is comprehensive and action-guiding for them must be subordinated to these rules. Citizens of such democracies who are believers experience, therefore, that a radical incoherence, as he calls it, has been introduced in their beliefs. Now, this is a very significant charge. Liberal democracies are failing to satisfy one of the political liberalism's own most basic stated goals, to ensure freedom for each person to live in accordance with his or her own interpretation of life or lack of it. Liberalism itself is illiberal. Incoherence in the structure of belief of the members of liberal democracies with universal visions translates into incoherence of the project of political liberalism. Add to this that liberal democracies are spreading fast, and that at the same time the number of believers worldwide is growing. The result is that more and more people will experience liberal democracies as profoundly illiberal. To live in them, they'll have to engage in what he later in the text called bad compromises, which is to say, give in to beliefs against their deepest convictions. Now, I think that Professor O'Donovan, or Oliver, is basically right about this, but he's right in regard only to some of the important contemporary theoretical accounts of what constitutes political liberalism. As I read his text, at times I have almost an impression that he thinks that liberal democracies are inherently illiberal in that sense, but that can't be right, because at other times he hopes that political liberalism can be conceived in ways that do not end up illiberal for believers, which is to say, for the majority of its citizens. So since his paper was on the whole, since in his paper political liberalism was on the whole getting bad press, let me offer here, let me do here a very foolish thing, and in the remaining 5 minutes of my presentation, offer rough contours, pillars, if you want, of an alternative account of political liberalism, which is formulated from a Christian perspective, and I'll do so in the form of very brief thesis. Then I'll suggest that it avoids the problems of political liberalism on which Oliver has zeroed in. So here are my 6 theses. First, the terms of civic association are derivable from the affirmation of the worth of persons that requires us to render them their due, above all, not wrong them. Second, there is no source independent of universal visions for engaging in public debates, and hence there can be no moral restraints placed on public use of religious reason. Third, Something like, roughly like, common grace of the one Creator is at work in all peoples and communities, no matter what universal visions they espouse, and no matter how pervasive their flawness is, to use the term that Serene has used. Fourth, the church is not the state, and the state is not the church. Two are distinct but interrelated spheres in which human beings live, at least majority of human beings do. By church here I mean religious communities. Fifth, the neutrality of the state with respect to universal visions does not mean separation of church and state, but states impartiality with regard to all universal visions. And sixth, the authority of the government when it functions in its proper boundaries, the authority of the government, even democratically elected government, is divinely sanctioned. In the final analysis, the alternative is either anarchism or divine sanction of government's authority. Now, those of you who are familiar with the writings on political philosophy of our former colleague here at YDS, Nicholas Walteser, will no doubt recognize his heavy imprint on every single one of these claims. I think that Nick is basically right. Does liberal democracy, understood as resting on these pillars, suffer from serious flaws, which Oliver highlights? So let me answer this in four objections and then responses. So first, Oliver's objection. Radical incoherence is part of the structure of belief of religious citizens of liberal democracies. Response? A Christian will have Christian reasons to affirm the kinds of regulations of social exchanges characteristic of liberal democracies. They can all be interpreted as all rooted in the respect for the person. And the claim that we should respect persons does not stand apart from Christian universal vision, but is for Christians part of the content of the common good. Objection 2. In liberal democracies, we are facing restraint on belief that is unacceptable to most religious people, certainly religious people of the book. That's the objection. Response, there's no restraint on bringing beliefs and reasons for belief into public sphere. There is only restraint on forcing these beliefs on others, a restraint widely accepted in the Christian tradition, as Oliver points out. Objection 3, Oliver's objection 3. Nobody may include, Oliver writes, in his doctrine the belief that it would be good if everybody believed the same thing. Response, to the contrary. All may include in their doctrine the belief that it would be good if everybody believed the same thing. Agreement is not a problem. Forced agreement is a problem because it disrespects and violates person holding views different from ours. Fourth objection, a believer can have no expectation to be heeded. Response, I see no reason why that would be the case. To the contrary, a believer brings her reasons into the public debate because she expects that she has a chance to be heeded. That expectation is grounded in the belief that on account of common grace, agreement across the divide of universal visions is possible. So, 1, there's no incoherence in belief and no undue restraint upon belief in the liberal democracy of the kind I envision. Now, could all Christians subscribe to the account of liberal democracy just offered? Many Christian positions are incompatible with such an account. For instance, those who resist distinguishing between church and state as forms of God's rule will find it incongenial, to say the least. But then, in my view, liberal democracy of a certain type is not the Christian position about how to arrange public life. It is a good and coherent Christian position, and for the complex and dynamic societies of late modernity, it is a better position than any other I have encountered. One more comment is in order, and here I will conclude. Here we are gathered to reflect on political theology not simply as Christians, but together with our Muslim friends. Though a Christian need not worry whether such an account of liberal democracy might introduce incoherence into her own beliefs, does a Muslim have to worry about the matter? After all, as presented, liberal democracy here rests on some important Christian convictions. I would hope, however, that Muslims would find affinity with liberal democracy as sketched here, even if it's true that historically liberal democracy emerged on Christian soil and that substantively the kind of liberal democracy I'm advocating rests on some important Christian convictions. It is a mistake to think that if something is Christian, it therefore cannot be also Muslim, or whatever else you can put instead of Muslim. All Christian convictions are not as such non-Muslim convictions. So I hope that Muslims might have Muslim reasons for adopting the kind of liberal democracy sketched here. Do they have such reasons? This question is not for me to answer. Maybe we'll hear something of an answer tomorrow. At any rate, I, a self-confessed Christian, know of no better way to make possible in contemporary societies for everyone, whether they're Muslims, Christians, or adherents of any other religion, or irreligion for that matter, to live their lives in accordance with their universal visions than liberal democracy properly understood. Thank you.
Well, let's give all of these. Thank you, genuinely. Those were 4 splendid responses. Now it's time for some question and answers. And I think we have a microphone right there. And I would ask you, this is the way they do it on C-SPAN and so forth. Start lining up and express your question and receive the answer, and then the next one will ask a question. And since I said that questions could be directed at the lecturer as well as the 4 panels, maybe, I don't know how we're going to manage that. Great. Is there someone who wants to step up and start our Q&A?
I'd be interested in hearing Professor O'Donovan's response.
Oh, response to the 4.
Any points you might want to make by way of stimulating further questions.
Are you prepared to undertake a little of that before we... And that might get folks loosened up a little, so they'll ask questions. No, I take it the spirit of Richard's suggestion. There's a few salient ones that strike you as especially either important or easy to answer or whatever.
Foolish.
None of them are easy to answer. I felt myself constantly like watching a speeded up film. You know, one keeps seeing important moments come before one and then they've gone before you can quite grasp them. I think Serene Jones has finally flushed me out. This is perfectly clear. She put her finger on something very important when she said that I'm a European. I've been a friend of the United States and a visitor to America since 1970 when I came over as a student to Princeton, have enormous debts here, and not of the kind the Inland Revenue are interested in, but intellectual debts, deep friendships, of always admired the intellectual life of this country, and I think never at any stage in my life have I felt the mutual comprehension gulf so wide as it is now. It really is a problem. A lot of the time, listening to Europeans talk about Americans, listening to Americans talk about Europeans, there is a measure of intercontinental drift opening up between us that is, I think maybe one just wasn't aware of it when one was young, but it seems to have got very wide. These are problems that Europeans are wrestling with. And I think this rather this rather confirms what I thought, that this is a problem, then the problem of public reason perhaps emerged from European traditions of thought and is embedded in European experience rather than American experience. And I mean, I'm simply astonished, delighted, full amazed, simply to be told that the problem of public reason has gone away over here. It doesn't exist. There are no bad guys anymore.
You go to the law school downtown.
Well, that's right. I didn't think I'd hear it up there. No. A great hero of mine, the Canadian George Grant, wrote perhaps one of his most potent essays entitled In Defense of North America. I'm clearly about to write an essay in defense of the United States. Anything that can get away with the problem of public reason like that certainly deserves defending. There is a modus vivendi between religion and public life here which does not exist in Europe anywhere. And that is just something to be faced. I mean, who stops Christians speaking in public, I'm asked? Well, just the other day, for those of you who don't see these little stories, the British Prime Minister made the great mistake of taking the word God on his lips in an interview. And all he said was, after one of those long, very tiresome interviews in which he said it was right to go to war in Iraq, and the interviewer said, no, it can't be, you're wrong, and so on, he said, well, God will have to judge whether it was right. And that remark had him crucified throughout the press, because the word God must not be used by a politician now in any circumstances. And that's just the assumption. Not only a prime minister, but anyone in or out of in public life just avoids any kind of religious discourse because you're lost. Now, these aren't governments who are introducing this kind of restraint. I've always felt the problem of power is not the problem of the power of government, it's the problem of the crowd. It's the problem of the consensus. The people are the problem. So when somebody tells me that the best reason for democracy is that it pluralizes power, I scratch my head. I don't understand this defense of democracy. Here's an answer to original sin. You collect all the sinners together in one place. Take all the power away from one wise or good man and give it to the sinners, yes. What does it do? This is just so mysterious, this argument. It just, so to me, as a European, it doesn't seem to amount to much. Let me conclude. I'm making some off-the-cuff reactions. It's after dinner. We're relaxing. It's jet lag. Thank you. Yes. But what would I like to see? I mean, Eric put his finger, he pressed me. He wants to know what happens if O'Donovan is ever taken as a serious guide to anything in politics. What does it begin to look like? Well, I can answer that. I think I can say some certain things here. First of all, there is less concern with constitution. Political questions are not reduced to constitutional questions. We stop discussing whether democracy is a good idea. Because we are not in a position where we actually have to construct political orders. This is a fantasy position. We're in a position where we have to live together in an order, the essential dimensions of which are given us by the circumstances and the culture in which we live, and in which we have to learn how to live in it. In other words, the problems are not those of the constitution builder. These are fantasy Enlightenment problems. Enlightenment in that bad sense that people use. There is a good sense for Enlightenment too. In Europe, we would stop trying to write constitutions left, right, and centre for our continent and for everywhere else, and we would attend to the inherent, viable, functional social traditions wherever we found them. And we would try to protect them and enshrine them in law. Places where it's evident that people know how to get on together, they must be allowed to get on together, and their getting on together must be protected by law and managed. In places where there is dysfunctionality in the way people get on together, then law has to try to address correctively and sympathetically, always aware of the local conditions that constrain the possibilities, and responding in good compromises to the ways in which those can function. Now, again, I don't want to speak for the Muslim participants in this conference, who I expect will have much to say. But we have a real problem in Britain, a number of serious problems over the traditions of some of our Muslim communities, particularly those from the Indian subcontinent, in living in very concentrated ways in some of our northern cities, especially, though not only there, and practices arranged marriage, for example, which have never been part of the local tradition and which most people think shouldn't be. Now, how does politics face that kind of question? It has to face it both extremely realistically and sensitively, and at the same time, as it were, bringing a real challenge from the wider public justice to it. It has to prevent, as it were, writing an answer in the air and then trying to impose it on the ground. It has to go into a situation like that and judge very carefully what works, and when it works, allow it and support it. And when it doesn't work, try to get to the bottom of why it's not working, and try and bring the correctives in that are necessary. This kind of thing, and this attention to the dynamics of communities, micro-communities, and other forms of communal tradition, are the things that make any civil society work. And so I suppose what a civil society would look like would be actually that it would be less personalist, less individual, less concerned about the equal relation of each and every separate individual to the state, and much more concerned about communities and the way they functioned, instinctively, naturally, and apparently when they work healthily. So start off, Jean.
Some of you ready to step up to that mic?
I'll ask two questions about the final points you made, Professor O'Donovan. First, how is it that somebody becomes capable of judging appropriately in a variety of local contexts, of going in and adjudicating what is it that works and what remedies could be given for things that do not work? What kinds of training, social, community formation, what kinds of standards is that person responsible to? How is somebody who can judge that way created? And secondly, one often hears about the great advantages of allowing communities their own locally constructed and particularly constituted in beliefs and practices and whatnot ways. Those of us who come from extremely closed off minority religious communities might have a somewhat different perspective on what actually living in a community like that looks like. It is, I think, very different to operate in what seems to be an atomized, individualistic, etc., and so on, democratic context that does not allow for, in large part, the creation of such communities, and in fact come from a community like that and understand the level of commitment that it takes to create a community like that in the modern world, but also the price that is paid by many of the participants in those communities. Yes, coming from such communities can offer wide perspectives, different belief options that are not live options for the broader public, but the price that is paid can be unbelievably high. And I'd like to hear you say more about how you take account of that.
Yes, I know that, because I'm Irish by background, and I'm well aware of the kind of intense constraints that highly normative communities can have. I had a friend who lived in a suburb of Dublin, and we were out walking one day, and I said to him, "This is a very charming suburb you live in, this is very nice." And he said, "Yes. And the best thing about it is, they don't poke their noses into their neighbour's business." And you could feel generations of resentment about noses being poked into neighbours' business sort of bursting out at the seams in this extraordinary response. All communities need adjustment. Some communities suffer from being too intense, of enclosing their members too closely. Whenever communities with, one might say, come into contact with one another, the different pressures that exist in different communities open up tensions on each side. As very sort of intensely disciplined communities come into contact with much more loosely disciplined communities, both sides find problems arising from this. Internal problems, new self-consciousnesses, new challenges to themselves. And what can one say about that except this is the being together that God has given us. There is no coping with that except by coping with it. There's no dealing with these problems in principle. There's only a dealing with them in the very living of this problem. Who is capable of these things, you ask? Well, who indeed? Clearly somebody who cares about the communities they live in, somebody who's had experience, wide communal experience, somebody who is responsive to the needs of their communities. I just want to remind us that this is what the politician used to be. The person who had come out of the community, who understood the community, who intuited and related between it and the wider discourse of the nation or of the international system, and spoke out of its experience and for its experience, and helped bring the critical perspectives back into it. That we no longer think of politicians as playing any such role suggests to me that, you know, that the virtues of representative politics that we used to have are not always actually practiced. Certainly, I speak again only as a European in the European culture, where everything is very different. But where, of course, being a politician is a profession. It's a profession you go into at the age of 22 and expect to rise to power by the age of 50. Doesn't function in that sort of way anymore.
This is unaccountable. Oh, here we go.
Certainly to Professor O'Donovan, but any in particular. My biggest worry in thinking about political theology and Christian theology relative to whatever particular political order it might exist in, that's a big issue. You know, living in Indonesia is not the same as living here in the United States or in Great Britain. And so we do need to have some grasp, it seems to me, of some of the large themes that the church in its own self-identity brings to whatever governmental situation it might find itself in. So sometimes we need to get a little more clarity about what those might be, and Miroslav was sort of angling in that direction here this evening, but I'm worried I haven't heard a lot about that yet. Secondly, here in the United States, it seems to me the problem is that the political realities of the civic society and the government, okay, those aren't quite the same, are such they dominate Christian life. Christian life is no more than making that work, whether one's a Republican or a Democrat or wherever one is. I mean, that's it. So you teach social ethics, how to make it work. That's it. Now, it seems to me Christian theology and Christian ethics has got to have something more to say about these matters than simply making democracy work. And I'm not hearing very much about that in terms of the kind of conversation that goes on in seminaries and so forth. I mean, it dominates it. How to make democracy work. So I'd like to hear some reflection on that.
Thrown open, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, it was thrown open.
In 3 minutes.
We were making Oliver O'Donovan do all the responding. Do any of the rest of you have a response to that? Well, Oliver, I guess it's up to you.
Eric.
Oh, Eric, sorry.
Well, I'm tempted to ask the evidence about, maybe it's because I'm in a religious studies department as opposed to a divinity school or a seminary, but the perception is that those Christian social theologies or Christian social ethics that are dominant in a lot of seminaries have actually asked the question you're asking and then abandoned the project of worrying about democracy and returned to, not in a sectarian fashion, but kind of highlighted the church as an alternative polis, the Christian life as more than just political.
Yeah, maybe that happens in one seminary. I'm not sure.
Okay.
You know, okay. I mean,
So if that's the case, then I think that is a real question.
Yeah. And I don't find it being dealt with.
Okay.
I just want to say that of course there is much more to be talked about there. And one's only excuse is that it's difficult enough to talk about one thing at a time, let alone to talk about everything. But obviously this is right. The Christian contribution to society springs from a commitment to God that is far beyond anything that can be talked about in terms of social contribution. And the Christian contribution to society is something far beyond what can be talked about in terms of democracy. That's something I'd certainly agree with.
Just a quick word. It does seem to me that in giving an account of how a Christian would locate a sense of the political order in the doctrine of creation, the doctrine of sin, and the doctrine of grace is making some very broad thematic claims about what would constitute both a relation to the political order, but some more general themes that would cut across Christian communities and their church's relation to the public order. So part of my silence is not understanding why that kind of move to begin to talk theologically in that way isn't addressing precisely that question.
Just one brief comment too. I'm struck often by the fact that in America so many of the debates among Christians are primarily about moral and social issues, And there's very little interest in systematic theology or the divides. They may rely on fundamental theological issues. And I think this is a question more, not just for ethicists, but for pastors and churches about theological literacy and education that transcends just worrying about same-sex marriage and social ethics and democracy. But it's good for enrollment in social ethics courses, but I think it's probably bad for the Christian church.
Yes. I'm going to start with Miroslav, because you said that this is the first session of a new program at Yale that has to do with problems of reconciliation, problems of conflict resolution. And I would like to ask you how you see American Christianity dealing with the role of America in world conflict, and the extent to which the world of American Christianity is able to grasp and grapple with that critical role that America plays in enhancing world conflict rather than world peace.
It's a great question. And it's a great task, I suppose, before us. I'm a kind of recently naturalized American, so I'm a half European and half American in some sense, I suppose. And I'm deeply puzzled by kind of the levels of commitment to nation on the part of the majority of Christians in this country. I'm scandalized about the flag and the Christian flag and the American flag in the church. I just, to me, that's a completely foreign concept. I come also from a country where we as Christians were an oppressed minority, and this kind of immediate identification with one's own country, and therefore with the projects of that country in the wider world, are a great source of puzzlement to me. And I think that sometimes the goddess nation is worshipped with kind of thinly veiled in religious garb in most of what is going on in some of the churches. Consequence then of that, of course, is inability to attend and to step back and ask about the role of this great nation in the world today and in conflicts in the world today. So I suppose I would want a much more critical stance toward the nation. And here I suspect we need to build more on the communities of faith, but on the other hand, I think communities of faith are precisely captive to the goddess nation.
Could we hear something from your American colleagues?
I'll just, three things. One, I have been very helped this year by being in conversation with Harry Stout about the Civil War and the status of religious arguments in that context. And I think we have, as theologians, yet to take full account of the legacy of that war with respect to our understanding of what it means to be a nation. And his argument basically is that the rhetoric of nation came in precisely at the moment when we as a country were most horrified by what religion was capable of producing, and yet nonetheless needed a place of coherence to hold us together. But it does strike me with respect to the present day context, the United States is, with respect to religious pluralism, by no means a model to be followed everywhere in its perfection, but nonetheless the best working example we have of possibility in the world today. And yet at the same time, with respect to its position in a global scene, it's the most aggressive when it comes to, in religious language, shutting down the possibility of conversation. And how do we hold those two realities together when it comes to theological claims? They sit there right smack next to each other. And it's ironic tension that really needs to be sorted through theologically and sociologically.
I would like to address the question of the American understanding of constitutionality as it relates to the problem of one person, one vote. I recall the Florida hand count situation in which the election was contested, and I thought about China and whether there could be 1.3 billion hand counts. And the problem that Homi Bhabha talks about, global measures, in which, at least in the Reformation, it seems that there was a shift towards the individual as opposed to the collective, and whether the vocality or the logos and the word theology sort of developed into this kind of freedom of speech and the democratization of religion which we experience. When I was in China, people said, we can't have the same kind of democracy just because we can't have 1.3 or 2.6 billion cars. In other words, the translation of logos into the pattern of vocality and then materiality just doesn't work when you have huge numbers. And I suppose that you have the same problems with Muslim cultures. And so this is the problem where you have European countries where Ireland has 4 million people, one vote in the UN, whereas China has 1.3 billion people, one vote.
I had a casual aside in my response where I said mass democracy presents its own challenges. That I think is a great question for political scientists, institutional analysis. Theologically, I guess I haven't even thought about reflecting on what that means. I mean, American democracy is not majoritarianism, it's democratic republicanism. And how, it may or may not be representative democracy anymore, but we don't have professional politicians. We still have, farmers who come and represent their community, and I'm telling the idealistic story that Professor Donovan doesn't want to hear about America. But,
Oilmen.
Pardon me?
Oilmen.
Oilmen, yes. But I don't know how to. I think that's the great question for mass democratic societies.
The question was particularly addressed to the United Nations structure, I think. Am I right? That's what the question was most concerned with. And the United Nations structure, it seems to me, is in it, the way it's put together, which is indefensible except as a piece of historical archaeology. But then no constitution, if I may say so, is anything but a piece of historical archaeology, including the American Constitution, is a reminder of the fact that the job that is to be done is deliberative. That is, voting is only a minor part of it. And that actually the national representatives getting together to hammer out policies that could secure wide consent around the world is what is at stake. That is what it's there for. And that direct representation, even though the present representative structure of the United Nations looks very, very strange and odd and is in itself arbitrary, direct representation of n millions of people per voter in the United Nations is not the point. The point is that the communities which operate in different parts of the world should actually be able to talk to one another. That's what, and that actually is a reminder of something that government and consultation and deliberation used to be about, again and again, which concentration on the notion of democracy doesn't necessarily help us see. And while we're telling the idealistic story about American democracy, I should throw in, just in order to be provocative, that it's extremely difficult for Europeans to understand how Americans can be so enthusiastic about democracy when they still adhere to a practice of almost unbelievable gerrymandering in congressional districts. Congressional districts are drawn up with the intention of achieving single opinion concentrations. They don't represent places, they don't represent communities, they represent so many Republicans and then so many Democrats. I mean, that's as I understand, we were in 2002 all entertained with the congressional maps that were drawn up of Florida and published in the British papers at that time. Now, you know, I mean, commitment to democracy involves, among other things, listening to communities, you know, this town, that county, letting them function together somehow with all their disagreements and come up with a voice. It's not just a question of so many individuals with so many votes.
I would like to ask a question that, if I may, since I see no one at the microphone. And it perhaps comes from a desire that I share with what Joe Jones said a little while ago, that the church needs to articulate and sustain and extend some of its own theological categories as it thinks about this range of questions, and not simply revisit discussions beyond sort of its own history and tradition. And I guess I want to ask in that connection whether something that Ron Rittgers talked something about tonight, and also Eric to a degree, whether, and if so, how a characteristic Christian commitment to the so-called doctrine of the two governments now operates, and whether there really is a lot left to it that has purchase. I mean, it usually has operated in part to, as I understand it, to address problems about the theocratic impulse, rather than the problems of overweening liberal culture. And perhaps Europeans are so struck with the latter difficulties that theocratic possibilities aren't high on their list of fears. But certainly there's a lot of loose talk about theocracy and theocratic impulses in the American psyche that are thrown around. And though this is a large question, I guess I want to know whether or not there's anything in your judgment, I know Oliver's written extensively about this, about whether or not this characteristic Christian commitment, at least in some traditions, to a so-called doctrine of the two as somehow endemic, whether that continues to, in your view, do any useful work, does it have ongoing relevance, where would it need to be elucidated further, where is it no longer interesting or applicable? Is there a kind of passion for a single society in which we don't divide things, something that some Christians feel more resonance to than they used to? So in short, are any of you willing to venture any comments about the relevance of that, especially as it pertains to theocracy, which is something we haven't discussed very much so far?
I'm not sure that Jean is right to say that the primary thrust of that doctrine has been anti-theocratic. I think it is also, I mean, it has frequently been anti-theocratic, but I think it does also operate the other way.
Oh, I agree. I didn't mean to say it was the...
To try to, in the hands of a Hildebrand or somebody like that,
Right.
to try to defend the church's freedoms. I think there's a real, part of the concerns, I suppose, that I was expressing indirectly today were about defending the freedoms of the church, defending the freedoms of believing communities, that there are freedoms there that it's a way in which one can define when government steps outside its role and becomes implicitly tyrannous and so on, and when its believers can't participate in it, right, and what others want to say.
I see it as relevant, but maybe not in the terms in which historically it's been constructed. I see it as a kind of all over the place in debates about legality and morality. When I make that distinction with students and in relation to the doctrine of the two governments, I'm struck more and more by how many of the students are very happy to live in